The concept of flying has long enamored humanity, the ability to rapidly move people and things across space and air. But where did this really start? How does it relate to our current civilization? What is so enthralling about flight anyway? Today we explore the concept of airship, the empire impossible of the old world. This will begin to make things right. Yes, I've been on hiatus for quite some time, well over a month almost. There have been a few releases, but I wanted to go back and look at our recent developments in our entertainment world, the Star Wars franchise. Star Wars has been with us as a film and now a television franchise since 1977, or intellectual property, or whatever we're calling it, and it's always something that's keen in our entertainment. There's even the Game of Thrones intellectual property returning with the Night of the Seven Kingdoms, the first two episodes of which feature a guy doing projectile poo and, of course, full frontal nudity. And we're talking like this is something wondrous or amazing and it's never happened before. I mean, you can go back and watch HBO shows in the early 21st century and you'll see the same things, but never mind, it's all new. And I recall Star Trek, Enterprise. I tried to get into the TV series back in 2001, and I recall the 7th episode, The Andorian Incident, where the Andorians beat up Captain Archer for about 45 minutes and threatened him, and then finally he decided to help them by diming out the Vulcans' listening post. Yes, that's the real plot of the episode. The point behind this is it's just entertainment. It's just a TV show. And now on to our exploration. Logistics impossible. What you're looking at here is the largest cargo plane ever constructed in the history of humanity, with 6 complete engines on it. And it's from the nation of Ukraine. It was destroyed during the Russian invasion of 2022, and there hasn't been another example made since. There is still the C-5 Galaxy in the United States inventory, which can transport 2 M1A2 tanks in its cargo bay. Now, with all of the C-5 Galaxies employed, you may be able to transport a heavy brigade combat team or an armor brigade combat team, or whatever they're calling them now, to a potential area of trouble. The real point behind all of this is aerial transportation, the ability to rapidly project logistics in a very short amount of time. During the Cold War, the United States, in its nuclear brinksmanship with the Soviet Union at the time, always wanted to showcase its capability. Air mobile feasibility demonstration, dropping a ballistic missile from the back of a plane and having it launch. It was never a practical exercise or put into production, but it did involve the strategic arms limitation talks of the 1970s. I'm not suggesting that it was all just a lot of blustering and maneuvering and there was no practicality behind it, but why do we have all these images of these airships? What could they really do? And what sort of infrastructure was required to support these airships, these incredible hangars, as you can see with a scale picture of these cars? This gives us the impression that in the past there was something far grander than what our understanding was led to believe. And the whole point of looking at entertainment in the past and looking at the recent developments that we have of where aviation technology has gone, it seems as though we had a greater capacity to project logistics across space and time in the past. Now, maybe you're thinking that's just some bizarre assertion that modern technology can overcome any sort of limitations, and after all, with our infinite application of artificial intelligence, or rather the ability to do deep learning and analytics, let's be honest, it's not the artificial intelligence that we thought of in the 20th century, you know, with sentience, or watch the film 2001, See HAL 9000, and see Knight Industries 2000 in the original Knight Rider series. That's what we thought of as artificial intelligence. But all that beside, what could you really do with the ability to project logistics across air? The concept of the airship was really the ability to rapidly move tremendous amounts of people and things across space in a limited amount of time. But what was the real capability behind it? There seemed to be a real fixation in the early 20th century or the early 1900s with these airships. And it wasn't just simply a matter of building balloons with gondolas on them, there were rigid airships. What was their true capability? Why were they built in this fashion? And many people simply say, well, it was merely a fixation of aviation at the time. That's why we had people who were achieving things in propeller planes and flying to places that could never be flown to. It's also ironic that an airship was utilized to reach the North Pole and the so-called Pole of Inaccessibility in the first time. It was not done with a sled dog team until, ironically enough, shortly before the first moon landing. But when we look at these airships, we have an idea of what was really required to support them. Look at the size of this hangar. Now, was this something that a civilization in the 1900s would have focused on, or was it something else? Is there something that we're missing about this entire story or account or history that we have of airships? It seemed to be something that there was an international fixation with. It was not limited to any one nation, although it tends to be attributed to the Zeppelins of Germany, as they were referred to, or Imperial Germany, and then picked up by the Weimar Republic, which was the successor German Republic after Imperial Germany ended at the end of World War I. But there were other nations that tested and utilized airships. And of course, the United States had quite the interest in airships, which seems to have been lost in the annals of history. At least the fixation on it seems to have been lost. What was really the purpose behind it? Was it just something to entertain people? And if we look at the images that still survive in the archives today, perhaps we could draw those particular conclusions, that that's what airships are really all about. Going back to the entertainment example that we had, some people still watch Star Trek Enterprise and they've never seen it before and they think it was a great series. Some people, when it came out, didn't really think much of it. I'll admit, I've never really been interested in it, and it's not that I despise the show, I'm just relatively indifferent towards it, much as I am towards the latest Game of Thrones incarnations. They may be great shows, although I've got to admit the showrunner talking about projectile poo and full frontal nudity doesn't exactly appeal to me. Maybe it appeals to someone else. I'm not here to tell you what to watch or what to like, but I am here to really consider what we actually think and what we view with certain things. We apparently built entire, incredible structures in the early 20th century to support docking facilities for these airships. Now, why would such a decision be undertaken during a time when, as we understand our official history, there were many limitations with infrastructure and construction? Well, actually, I know what you're about to say. No, Aurelian, you're completely wrong. There were no limitations in the 1800s and the early 1900s. We could really do anything that we wanted. And if we take all of our history at face value, it seems to be that is absolutely true. In the United States, for example, we built an incredible railroad system where none existed before. We built the highway system. We're not even talking about the interstate system, which followed World War II and, ironically enough, took much longer, it seemed, to construct than the highway system. But there's numerous justifications for that, and there's numerous reasons for that. People worked harder in the past. Real people worked, and they had a purpose. But if that's the case, then why were these technological developments just simply dropped? You can actually find a little bit of an analogy with the development and employment of the airship to the recent Concorde, or supersonic passenger travel. The Concorde, that incredible plane that was fielded in the 1970s, and you can even see one at the start of Superman 2, whichever version of Superman 2, but the one with Christopher Reeve, where you see him dramatically flying past a Concorde to reach Paris to stop the deadly attack that's about to occur there. But the analogy being, airships seem to offer many different forms of transportation. They offered personal transportation, and they also offered the ability to transport widespread logistics. Now, what do we mean by that? Well, we looked at our example of the great cargo plane constructed in Ukraine, which I'll admit is kind of surprising. We would have expected the United States or Soviet Union or Russia to construct the largest cargo plane in the world, but whatever, anyone can make an incredible technological advancement. It's not limited to any one nation. But we never seem to have the desire that we had in the past to construct aerial vehicles that could transport large amounts of logistics. If you want to deploy an Armor Brigade combat team from the United States Army, well, you do it on the water. That's the most effective way. You would think, though, that there would have been more developments towards air technology and the ability to rapidly move large amounts of people and, of course, large amounts of equipment. In the particular case of the Armor Brigade combat team, 70-ton steel beasts, well over hundreds of them, to various locations across the land, especially since we understand the United States military is the only military to this day that seems to be focused on expeditionary deployments all over the continents, all over the land. But looking at the past, we do see this example that even as early as World War I, there was a focus on air travel. The early development of the aeroplane. And remember that prior to the 20th century, there really was no airplane. It started with the Wright brothers at Kitty Hawk. But there were balloons well before then, according to the official history. But what about the airship? Was the airship really the development of that technological tree, or was it something else entirely? When you look closely at airships, especially the rigid airships, you seem to have hints of more incredible technology. There's the legacy of the Graf Zeppelin, the successful airship, one that apparently operated with hydrogen, and we understand the difficulty and the danger with that. We're all well aware of the Hindenburg disaster, which, by the way, it seems that everyone is inclined to show that explosion. But what does it really relate to? What does it really show us? The official explanation was, well, you could utilize helium in these rigid airships and they would be safe. But only the United States had helium, and even though the United States had tested and acquired airships of its own extensively during the 1920s, after the Hindenburg incident, it decided not to follow up on the development and employment of airships. Now, of course, we have all this talk. We have a lot of talk in the 21st century about bringing back this technology. And we also have talk about returning to the moon. And so far, we've sent a bunch of dummies to the moon. Again, officially, but it's not sending human beings to the moon like we were capable of doing in the mid-20th century. So what to really make of it? Is it an actual limitation? Is it just simply a lack of desire to do certain things? Is it because we don't really care to do certain things? We have other focuses and fixations here in the 21st century. We've evolved. We constantly have people that question everything that we think, and even the concept of thinking. Yet with particular images like this, the archive will tell you that this was merely a wind that caused this particular airship to tilt up like this, in this particular manner, on top of the mooring tower. Is that what really happened? Or are we seeing some sort of incredible capability of the airship to maneuver in ways that seem to be beyond our understanding? Also consider the concept of lift capacity. Here we have an official image of an airship near a boat at sea, and yet we have what's supposed to be a fictional drawing of an airship having a lift capacity to actually pick a boat right up off the water? Why would anybody bother drawing that? Well, because it's a very elaborate and imaginatory image. We want to inspire people with creativity. Or is it possible that airships did actually have that capability? That they really were a recovered technology? A technology that was from a previous civilization that was lost, that's not discussed in the official archives. That if it could have been salvaged effectively and made to work, it could have offered a tremendous capacity for our present civilization to really utilize air mobile operations to achieve logistics that we can only begin to imagine. Of course, we believe that we've reached the pinnacle of logistics in the fact that you can order anything off of Amazon and they can have it to you in 24 to 48 hours. Sometimes less, sometimes maybe just a little bit more. But really, are you moving the actual amount of materials that we see in the past that were used to construct these incredible towns, these cities, these highways, these railways in a very short amount of time? What actually is the timeline for construction? And what did we really lose with the understanding of our technology of airships? The more you look into the development of the technology of airships, you'll find again more conflicting accounts. The capacity, what they could actually do. There's even some legends, and let me phrase this very carefully. Legends, myths of the Graf Zeppelin completing its round-the-world trip in a very short amount of time. No, not up to a month, but under 24 hours. Again, those are just wild legends. But just imagine for a moment what if it were possible. What if the real intention behind the streamlined designs of these rigid airships was that they could move a lot faster through the air than we can begin to imagine? Apparently, even though the airship was abandoned right prior to World War II, there were balloons and airships that were utilized in the atomic tests. Yes, we do have numerous images of that. So what exactly is that supposed to tell us? Was there something else that was being tested at the time, or was there some other consideration? Why would anybody really want to go away from airship travel? It seems to be very cheap and effective, and people who defend the mainstream narrative often say that cost is the ultimate defense for everything. Or if I'm Tom Brady and I'm announcing a football game, I would say it's the ultimate defensor for everything. There's many different ways to say certain things. But what if there had been a different technological tree that was pursued, or perhaps we should say technology that was salvaged more effectively? Could it have offered a very different world than the one that we're living in today? Could we have had more ready air transportation? Is it because of the fact that we're just simply not supposed to go to different places? We're not supposed to have independent air travel. And let's be honest, air travel, for official reasons of safety, is one of the most controlled forms of travel to this very day. Yes, you can say we have little plastic drones that we can fly and give us very dramatic footage from the air of numerous things, but there's a lot of regulation on that as well. And maybe there is good reason for it. Perhaps there's not. But when you look at these old images, you can see that there's actually many more variants of designs behind airships than we like to think or believe. There seem to be the individual airships that just 2 or 3 people could utilize, just for a little bit of a joy cruise, if you will, around the neighborhood. And then you have the more elaborate and exotic rigid airships. And what was their true carrying capacity? How many people could they carry? Was it really just limited to 40 to 100 people? Or is it possible that these airships could have carried hundreds or even thousands? Well, we know what the official history says, and you can certainly look at the designs on your own. But it does really inspire the dreams and the understanding if these airships had much greater capacity in terms of their lift capability and in terms of what they could carry. Also examining some of the engines. These engines always seem to be a lot more elaborate and more advanced than the simple propeller engines that we understand were in existence at the time. Even looking at the interior luxury that was offered in airships. And remember, this is all early 20th century, or 1900s to 1930, and oddly enough, we see some analogies that we have with the same large ships that were available for sailing on the sea at the time. Was this really luxury, or was this merely selling the concept of luxury to people? Or is it possible that these ships in the air, much like the ships on the sea, were salvaged from something else? That they were found in some state of disrepair and repaired and put back into service. And whatever technology could be reverse engineered, it was done so, and that's why we have these airships. But over time, the ability to actually maintain them and to keep them functioning was actually lost. It's rather interesting to me that defenders of the mainstream narrative claim that the reason that we can't construct buildings in the manner that we used to is because the knowledge or the expertise of stonemasons, although to just say that all those old world buildings were made of stone is very disingenuous and overlooks many of the other materials that we've seen on these numerous old world structures. Example, Polk County Courthouse in Des Moines, Iowa. It's certainly not a stone structure. It seems to be some more advanced form of concrete, but somehow is available in Iowa in the early 1900s, or any structure anywhere for that matter. You really just have to overlook a lot of things when it comes to technological advancement. You also have to accept the fact that, well, everything was made out of stone, and the stonemasons decided not to pass down their skills. Why? Well, if a very critical skill was not passed to the future generation, then how can we really trust anything, to include our historical accounts? Well, because there's always been some regulatory body that we could depend upon, even though our own historians admit that governments of the past were relentlessly corrupt. Yet, as the saying goes, Napoleon always said, "I will always be adhering to history no matter what." No, there's no record of Napoleon saying that, but somebody could actually say that quote and try to defend something. The victors write history, so they say. Or people who never had anything to fight for actually write history. There's all sorts of different sayings. Were you aware that the United States Army apparently had quite a series of airships or blimps that they utilized in the 1920s for aerial reconnaissance? I think of the accounts that we have of the United States Civil War with the balloons that were used for reconnaissance. What I found rather striking, though, in examining some of these images of these airships, whether they were used by the United States Army, the Navy, or whoever, they do seem to have some more advanced sections on them that don't necessarily conform to our understanding of what the capabilities or designs were of airships. Were they airships? Were they balloons? Was it some sort of combination design? What exactly was the purpose of this large gondola? Or was it something else entirely? Was the entire airship itself not just simply filled with air, but it was actually an entire vessel that had a vast interior, that could carry multitudes of people, that had no limitations from our current understanding of lift capacity? It seems like it's something that's just merely a fantasy. But why do we have all these designs? Why was there such a focus on this? Why was there so much architecture even during a time when we understand our civilization was struggling in many ways? We had wars, we had numerous other issues with diseases, sicknesses, especially at the beginning of the 20th century. It's all very well documented in the history that you would expect there to be other focuses. And yet, there was this entire focus and this effort that seemed to be quite international, so to speak, to develop and employ these airships. What if they really did offer something that we can't even begin to imagine right now? That if we actually had adapted this technology tree as our primary means of transportation and even logistics, then what limitations would we really have? Who would even be bothering with drones if you actually had an airship that could transport a large quantity of something from point A to point B? And then you had smaller airships that could actually move the quantity of whatever you wanted to the end user. Yes, it's logistics. It's actually thinking about logistics. And oddly enough, we have these interesting sketches that give us the impression that there really was something more to these airships. This is supposed to be a crew sleeping quarters, apparently, from the Graf Zeppelin or any other number of rigid airships. But what if it was actually a drawing that seems to inspire things that we have of a vast effort of a large group of people to survive some sort of calamity? Really think about this, because we considered the theory that ships on the sea, or the great hulks that ended up in numerous places across the land and ports all over the place, were just simply people that were rushing to a particular area. The gold rush in California, or the effort to colonize a particular area, utilizing that very, very bad word. But why? What if it's possible that airships themselves also serve this purpose? That you were able to escape a calamity or a reset event by putting large numbers of people into these airships and sending them in the sky, where they could just simply stay suspended over the disaster that befell the land. Or perhaps it was something else, some other terrifying threat that we can't even begin to imagine. When you start to consider these other possibilities and these other explanations, it suddenly starts to give answer to the how there could have been a previous civilization, how they could have survived. And you look at many of these older images of airships flying over these older cities, and it almost gives you a completely different impression of what could have been available in the past, what could have truly been possible. Not limited by simple aircraft or a 6-engine turbopropeller plane, of which only one example was constructed until it was destroyed during a recent conflict. You also try to reconcile all of these images and even these examples that we have of these incredibly large hangars that were constructed to support this infrastructure behind the use of the airship. And once again, it's something else that seems to defy our understanding of history. Why would somebody go to the effort to build all of these large, incredible hangars? You would think that somebody would have identified that flight, whether it was through propeller or even jet engine, and by the way, look at the development technology tree behind the jet engine and contrast it with the development of the original glider and the original planes, even before World War I. Also try to understand the exact development path behind the engines that were used to power airships. Now, is it all just a fantasy? Did the Graf Zeppelin really make a very short transportation time to circumnavigate the world, if that's what you want to call it? That's how you want to think of it. We do have a very well documented account of the Graf Zeppelin traveling all across the land, and it set numerous records for the time. But as we understand it, it took nearly a month to do, and actual flight time was well over 21 days. But again, there still exist other accounts and, dare I say, conflicting accounts that indicate that this flight occurred in a much shorter time frame, that the Graf Zeppelin was actually able to cross all the lands in just under 24 hours. It sounds impossible. Maybe it is impossible, and maybe it is just a myth. But yet, for whatever reason, those stories still continue to endure to this day. There are numerous examples of what the airship was truly capable of. And even if it wasn't that fast, even if it didn't offer that capability, what about the potential capabilities for it actually being a tremendous asset with projecting logistics? If it actually had those capabilities, if it actually had such a lift capacity to where it really had no limitations with the amount of people and materials it could carry, then suddenly you have the answer to the how an old world civilization could have constructed these incredible cities, these marvelous highways, these numerous implementations that we have of varied forms of transportation. And they certainly didn't just rely on aerial transportation. They no doubt had various forms of rail, they had trolleys, they had the means to move people and materials to any location in a very short amount of time. And oddly enough, if we look at the official history and try to understand just how rapidly places such as the United States, Australia, Canada, and many others developed in a very short amount of time, if those timelines are in any way accurate, then something with a tremendous capacity and capability would be required to actually explain it. Yes, a lot of people say, well, they had the trains and that's all they really needed. Is that really true, though? Because it takes a lot to actually build train tracks, especially through varied elevations, to build an incredible logistics empire. And maybe that's the real piece that we've been missing, that the empire impossible is answered by the airship. Here's where things get even more interesting. There's a little bit of a blending, as there tends to be, between the actual history and fiction. A lot of fictional concepts for what airships could do. I think many have seen Sky Captain in the World of Tomorrow, and then there's even this article that appeared in Science and Mechanics in the 1930s that talked about a vacuum-powered airship. And yet we seem to see a concept for the ability of an airship to travel much faster in a very short amount of time. What do you think? Do you believe this was possible, or was this all just science fiction and fantasy that somehow found its way in a Science and Mechanics magazine? Let me know what you think in the comments about airships. One century ago, the sky was filled with wondrous airships. This was the height of the era, the time when airships were being experimented with by the nations that had been adversaries in World War I and would become adversaries again in World War II. What were the limits of the capabilities of these airships? Was this just a temporary foray by the civilizations at the time to develop a new form of transportation? Or is there another story behind these airships? Was this some sort of technology that was rediscovered from a previous civilization? Or is it simply as we're told in the mainstream account? Come join me today as we examine the account of airships and look for the actual explanation behind their rise and their fall.
I realize that nothing we've been doing is new. We haven't been tapping into new areas of the brain. We've just been awakening the most ancient.
Advanced airships, or the rigid airship design as it was known as. Originally they started off being called Zeppelins, and they were developed in Germany according to the official history. And yet, the other nations that contended for dominance with Germany developed their own airships, such as these designs from the United Kingdom that followed after World War I. The official history also tells us that Zeppelins were used to bomb the United Kingdom during World War I, prior to the advent of the long-range bombers that were used in World War II. And we see many interesting and intriguing designs that show the capability of these rigid airships. We don't have anything like rigid airships now today. Of course, there are other forms of airships. We think of balloons, and we of course think of the blimps that we often see in football games, such as the Goodyear blimp. But we can look and see this development timeline here of the airships from the United Kingdom, and we can see that most of their development actually started before the interwar period. And so it seems as though there was more of a, at least, sharing of technology or an awareness of this airship technology. The rigid airships were the most advanced, and they had the greatest capability of the blimps, and of course the other variations of balloons that had been around, at least since the 1700s according to the official history. And naturally we see how all these airships ended up in the United Kingdom, destroyed in trials, deleted and demolished, and as you look in the other designs, that's what you'll see. Yet, in this particular exploration, I'm going to try to showcase some images that are a little bit more rare, at least in terms of awareness. And we can see that these airships included massive hangars. Other great capabilities that we often see in our explorations. There's also the many towers that have unique construction capabilities behind them that were used to moor these airships to. Perhaps the most interesting thing about airships, in addition to their all-terrain capability and their ability to move around regardless of certain situations, is where they can land or where they can moor to. This is a very interesting tower, and the building at the base of it is quite intriguing as well. What happened to all these towers? Were they all torn down? When we look at the rigid airship, though, we consider the mainstream historical account. We're informed that in the 1870s there was the initial idea to develop airships. Ah yes, another wondrous design plan that came from the 1800s, because what else would it be? Yet when you look at some of these images, you can see that there was a lot of detail that went into the construction of these airships. We have to think about the hangars, we have to consider all these materials that had to be assembled, processed, and yet at the same time, in the early 1900s to the 1930s, they managed to achieve all of this. Now, I'm not suggesting that this was impossible, just very impressive. And of course, the official history tells us why the airships had such a sudden rise to fame and popularity, and why they instantly diminished from their massive use. Would you be surprised to know that airships, or zeppelins as they were called from Germany, provided the first transatlantic transportation? So imagine what kind of infrastructure capabilities you'd have. We'll be looking at the Graf Zeppelin later, perhaps the height of design of the rigid airship, and also the means in which it was funded. Apparently, William Randolph Hearst, who we've looked at before, was a significant proponent of airships and even provided financial support. Here we can even see one of the remaining airship hangars next to modern fighters. Something about it does seem to indicate, though, a greater advanced technology, and that's probably one of the main reasons why airships are so compelling, especially to alternative researchers. And yet, even if you accept the mainstream account of history, you have to acknowledge the fact that there was quite a lot of focus that was put into the development of the airship. Going off of the official history with Germany developing the first airships, or zeppelins as they called them, they seemed to understand the maximum capabilities that could be achieved with a rigid airship. There had never been any sort of flying device that could deliver munitions to another nation, and while this might be a more pernicious or violent form of use of airships, it does reflect their transportation capability. Indeed, with the construction of the Graf Zeppelin, we understand that Germany had achieved the heights of airship construction. And as part of the reparations for World War I, they even built an airship for the United States Navy, which apparently saved the Zeppelin program. This was the USS Los Angeles. So isn't this an intriguing account? We have Germany who attacked the United Kingdom, and you can find no shortage of monuments across the United Kingdom about airship attacks or Zeppelin attacks that occurred in World War I. Yet, apparently, Zeppelins were not regarded the same way that naval warships were, because after World War I, there was a lot of limitation concerning the construction of naval warships, as people feared their use. But apparently they didn't fear the Zeppelin. And so the United States and the United Kingdom decided to build or order their own Zeppelins from Germany, and then eventually improved upon their designs. At least, again, that's what the official history tells us. Of course, if you step far enough back, you have to realize that there's a lot more that goes into the construction of these impressive airships. You can see that there are no shortage of images of these vehicles being docked to towers and also being landed on the ground. And so it seems as though there's no limit to their capability. You don't have the same constraints that you do when you're operating fixed-wing aircraft or even rotary-wing aircraft. You actually have a capacity to transport logistics in a means that you can't even begin to conceptualize. Oddly enough, the interior photos of airships seem to be quite limited, and we tend to see a very austere making of the interiors, as though the crews were a little bit cramped, and we have to recall that the availability of images may or may not reflect the reality of what technological achievements that were brought about with the rigid airship. Now, we referred earlier to the blimps and the balloons and why they were limited. They didn't match the rigid airship in terms of their range and their capability to transport vast amounts of materials or logistics across vast distances. Here we can even see the construction of one of the original airships that was taken to the United States, which is how we explain there already being a U.S. logo on the side of it for the United States Navy. Very intriguing. We can also see in other images all the effort that went into the initial construction. So step back and look at this holistically. You have to establish these massive hangars that are far larger than any of the hangars that we have for current fixed-wing aircraft. And you also have to be able to assemble all these advanced construction materials. They seem to be able to quickly share the designs and the plans and the schematics and rapidly assemble these airships. Also, from the mainstream historical account, there's no shortage of apparent disasters or failures that occurred. Some airships that were destroyed by bad weather, others that had simply been crashed for any variety of reasons, and this was well before the Hindenburg, which would be the final event that would end the era of the airship. So, in the mainstream historical account, we do have examples of the airships failing, but yet the nations did not deter from actually researching and building airships. Instead, they continued to build larger and more capable airships. But is that really what happened? Or, when we look at these images, are we actually seeing another example of technology that was recovered from a previous time, and the current nations of the current civilization were attempting to press these incredible devices back into service, trying to restore them, much in the same way that we theorize that older structures were actually restored and refurbished and brought back to service. Now consider if that may be true. then it would explain why we have this rapid rise of airships across multiple regions. If Germany was so keen on its Zeppelin technology, then even after World War I, why would they be sharing it with the Allies, or at least the nations that were their former, and in the minds of many people at the time, according to the official historical account, their current adversaries? It tends not to make a lot of sense, and yet oddly enough, it's a bit of a parallel with what happened with World War II, as the German war machine developed weapons that were very advanced, and then once the war ended, the Allied nations, or at least the nations that had been the Allies that would become NATO, and even the Soviet Union and the Warsaw Pact nations, all wanted to acquire this advanced weapons technology. It goes back to that whole story of the jet fighter. The United States Air Force was initially surprised by the jet fighter, the Messerschmitt Me-262, and yet the swept-wing design did not provide the Germans a decisive advantage. Official history tells us that they didn't have enough of them. But then the United States was surprised in the Korean War a few short years later when the MiG-15 surprised them as a swept-wing design. Ah yes, these great militaries always being so surprised. But going back to the original designs of the airship, we can see that there was a lot of effort that was put into it. You'll find these images that show these great airships operating over the wondrous cities of the land in the early 1900s. And according to the official history, the height of the airship was from the mid-1920s to the 1930s, ending with the Hindenburg disaster. A disaster that there just happened to be a camera crew there ready to film. And even though we have accounts of the other airships that failed in what seemed to be a spectacular fashion that were viewed by tens of thousands of people, this did not deter from the development. So what's really going on here? This is one of the questionable conflicting accounts that we have. Imagine what you could do, though, with the maximum capabilities of an airship. And looking at some of these advanced designs that we have, this seems to hint towards something that goes beyond what our understanding is of an airship. Now, granted, we're looking at images, and I acknowledge these images may or may not be authentic. That's always something we have to consider, because there do seem to be certain questionable aspects about them. But ultimately, I'll leave it to you to decide on the veracity of the images, as we always have to maintain a keen mind when we're doing these explorations. Do these really show these facilities that were actually discovered or rediscovered and pressed back into service that may have had these materials or these designs that were still stored within them for who knows how many of years? And we also have accounts of new materials that needed to be developed to complete the construction of these wondrous devices of transportation. So was it really what we were told with the historical development, that Germany had these great ideas in the 1870s and finally Count von Zeppelin managed to bring them about to a successful design, and then the other nations simply bought or copied the designs and then attempted to improve on them? Or is there something a lot more behind all this? That this was understood to be an advanced element of transportation technology that was now available to the Fifth Era civilization? That, like the buildings you can see in these images, that they press this technology back into service. Because you'll find, oddly enough, the association of the airship with many science fiction concepts. The ability to be able to travel without limited range and consider what other means of propulsion they may have had. There's many conflicting accounts about how fast these airships were actually able to travel. Mainstream agrees that they were limited to 60 to 80 miles per hour, and of course it depends on the wind. But we also think back to the earlier accounts of the sailing ships during the so-called Age of Discovery, and how traveling at 9 miles per hour was considered quite an achievement for these sailing ships, and yet somehow they managed to sail tens of thousands of miles over just a few short months. That's from the mainstream historical account. Looking at some of the designs, though, of the rigid airship, and what makes it very impressive is the internal functioning and also the layout. Remember that the difference between the rigid airship and the blimp is that the rigid airship actually has the skeletal construction, which then has the outer skin put around it, and then, at least according to the official historical account, is filled with hydrogen. Although they prefer to use helium, as helium was certainly not flammable or inflammable or any of the other word tricks that you use with that which can easily catch on fire. You can see, though, that there are so many images that show that these rigid airships could land anywhere. There were towers that seemed to be all over the land that had to be constructed, in addition to the hangars. And here we see the Graf Zeppelin next to the R-101. both examples of the height of rigid airship technology from Germany and the United Kingdom, and quite an impressive sight to see these two airships in the same image. The construction photos, though, are intriguing as we oftentimes just see the skeletal examples of the hull of the rigid airships, but oftentimes we see few workers that are actually involved. There's also the matter of where were the designs for these incredible towers that seem to be all over the place. These towers that seem to be constructed just for the sole purpose of mooring an airship. Now you might ask, well, if they could just land anywhere on the ground, what would you need the towers for? Perhaps there was some other explanation for what the towers were actually used for. Or maybe we have to consider that there were so many airships that having the towers enabled you to moor several of them to the tower. Granted, it's a theory, but when you look at some of the internal schematics for what we have of airships, there seems to be a lack of understanding for what their true layout or purpose was. Indeed, we have little notes that are added and other notes that are added to try to indicate exactly what the real purpose and layout of the gondola or the control center was. I think what's most intriguing to me about airships, and I will confess that I've always had a personal interest in aviation, and whether it's fixed-wing aircraft, rotary aircraft, and of course airships, there's always the amazing capability of what flying could really provide to a civilization. You could say it ultimately frees the individual to be able to travel anywhere in the land. It also gives the capability of a civilization to rapidly transport large quantities of material, improving the infrastructure. You don't need to rely on roads. Now, of course, we do have to acknowledge what are some of the vulnerabilities with the airship. Officially, we understand that they are vulnerable to bad weather. Also, they could not travel as fast as the fixed-wing aircraft that were just in their infancy. Although I think what's most interesting to me when I did the research concerning rigid airships is the fact that they were the ones that provided the first transatlantic transportation capability. Long before Lindbergh even did his first transatlantic flight, and the great masters of aviation from the late 1920s through the 1930s achieved their feats. When you look at some other images of the components of airships, you can't help but be impressed by how advanced they appear. Here we see examples of the interior design having construction materials that seem to match some of the most capable and advanced materials that went into planes. And keep in mind what we know about fixed-wing aircraft from World War I. They were very rudimentary. They were really just a few levels beyond the gliders that the Wright brothers used with just a single propeller. And those were the mainstays of World War I. And yet during World War I and right after World War I in the interwar period, all the nations were using these rigid airships, at least all the nations that would become the primary antagonists of World War II. So was there really some sort of research effort that was being undertaken? Someone was looking for some sort of decisive advantage that they would have. And of course, we don't know the exact situation that was going on at that time. We're certainly informed of it, but it's very odd that Germany, the nation that was blamed for World War I and had to pay war reparations, was still encouraged to continue this Zeppelin development. In fact, we're even informed that Zeppelins would have died out in the 1920s if it wasn't for the sudden order by the United States for the USS Los Angeles, as the USS Los Angeles was a rigid airship that had many of the same design principles as the Graf Zeppelin. And let's explore the Graf Zeppelin, the very best design. The Graf Zeppelin is most famous for the fact that it seemed to be the most traveled of the great rigid airship designs. And you'll find no shortage of images of the Graf Zeppelin over every major and recognizable terrain across the land, such as in the United States. And the other strange thing is, according to the official account, the Graf Zeppelin, being a German Zeppelin or rigid airship, was welcomed and even funded by someone such as William Randolph Hearst. You know, when he wasn't busy building his amazing castle out there in the isolated portion of the Western California coast. You can see, though, that wherever the Graf Zeppelin was, there were images taken of its immense presence and its wondrous inspiration over the great terrain features or incredible structures that reflect an entirely different existence. And people often wonder why alternative researchers can get the idea that these rigid airships reflected a very different time. When you see these images with these old world buildings, it almost gives us the impression that this was a completely different world, that this was a time that never really existed in the manner that we were told. Now, perhaps that's just simply a coincidence of appearances, and it's also just another coincidence that the images of these great airships over these old world cities happen to inspire other science fiction tales. Or perhaps there's an entirely different account that we might not be aware of. Concerning the Graf Zeppelin, we understand its wondrous capabilities and its ability to transit the entire world. We're informed that, according to the mainstream account, the Graf Zeppelin was the first aircraft that did a round-the-world trip. Now again, this was due to funding and the sale of special stamps, apparently. It was also because of the support of William Randolph Hearst and other individuals. Why exactly would these individuals from the United States be so keen on supporting this transportation capability, this unique design that came from a rival nation? And even during the period of the Weimar Republic, that was the government that Germany had after the end of World War I, before the rise of the National Socialist Workers' Party in the 1930s, why would these nations be willing to fund this device? And you can see there are some images that show us some of the opulence and amazing luxury that was available on the Graf Zeppelin, and subsequently the Hindenburg. Now, the Graf Zeppelin was the largest rigid airship of its time, and the Hindenburg exceeded it. But the Graf Zeppelin is most famous because it had the greatest achievements, flying around the world or across the lands, however you want to look at it, and even committing a polar flight. All very impressive. Why is it that the nations turned away from these airship designs if they knew that the answer was helium? Because the Hindenburg disaster simply revolved around the use of hydrogen, which, unfortunately, was prone to failure, or at least quite a difficult situation with fire. Looking at the round-the-world flight, we have conflicting accounts between how long this flight took. Officially, it was 22 days, but there are other accounts that say that the flight occurred in a much shorter amount of time. Now, I wasn't there, I don't know for sure, but even at the 22 days figure, the fact that this was the first aircraft, any form of aircraft, that managed to complete a round-the-world or across-the-lands flight is very impressive. And that's probably the most interesting element of the Graf Zeppelin, is the fact that it went everywhere and anywhere. And again, here in the Soviet Union, where the Graf Zeppelin operated out of Leningrad, today's St. Petersburg, and Archangel all the way up on its little polar expedition. Apparently, all the former adversarial nations to Germany decided to support the development and use of this incredible Zeppelin. And is it just because everybody was utterly enamored with the technology? The polar journey of the Graf Zeppelin is intriguing in and of itself, as it involved meeting up with an individual on site to showcase the capabilities of the Graf Zeppelin. And perhaps that's one of the most alluring details that we have about these rigid airships, is that they could go anywhere. We have an account of the Graf Zeppelin going anywhere, such as linking up with this Norwegian explorer who bears a striking resemblance to Mark Hamill from the film Slipstream. There were even other airships that were actually employed to support this journey, and earlier airship journeys that actually enabled the explorers to finally reach the North Pole. So isn't it interesting how even in the mainstream account, the use of airships and their capabilities finally allowed people to reach areas that they had never reached before? And it was as though the Graf Zeppelin was merely a culmination of this developing technology. But was it? Or was this a technology that was already well known and was simply being tested to see what the limits of its capabilities were? Was the Graf Zeppelin really flying around the world just to show that it could be done? Was it really flying up to the Arctic just to show that it could be done? Or was there some other intention behind this? Was this really truly the unlimited range mission that only a rigid airship could undertake, to really explore the very limits of the land? Oddly enough, we're supposed to believe that Captain Cook was the one who defined the limits of the land, even though he missed discovering the entire Antarctic continent. Well, if you have a rigid airship, you can go anywhere. You can explore anything. You have no limitations on your range. And ultimately, if you can build a larger one, if you can lay it out with all of the needs and requirements of the crew and the passengers, you really have an airship that could go anywhere. And the Graf Zeppelin proved that it could be done. And amazingly enough, it managed to complete all these achievements without any sort of disaster. Now, they certainly ran into difficulties. After all of these incredible achievements, though, the Graf Zeppelin finally met its untimely demise when, after the destruction of the Hindenburg, it was simply forgotten and scrapped, to be used by a regime that would go on to conduct World War II. And thus the great achievements of the Graf Zeppelin seem to have been lost to history in many ways. Yet there was a time when this was, according to the mainstream account even, the pioneering advent of the capability of what we could do in the air. And it's probably one of the reasons why this continues to be an alluring account for us of what the rigid airship could do. You couldn't do this with a blimp, you couldn't do this with a balloon. But yet, what was the true time that the Graf Zeppelin managed to travel, whether it was across the lands or up on its polar expedition? People will claim that they know the exact times, and maybe they are correct. But there are other accounts that say otherwise. And let's look at the future or past, but not the present. So the account that airships could provide wondrous transportation capabilities in the future. We have seen articles that allude to the revival of the airship or a great renaissance in the use of the rigid airship and other means of powering them. We also have the visualization of how airships, according to the official history, have inspired science fiction or even the steampunk genres. Great fleets of airships that went across the sky, and perhaps they utilized other means of managing to defy whatever the pull is from the ground, whether you consider it gravity or something else. We even have this wondrous image of something such as the Eiffel Tower that might have been a great mooring post for airships. And suddenly the construction of the Eiffel Tower makes a lot more sense as something that had an applicable use to support transportation, and not merely as a wondrous showcasing trinket for yet another World's Fair. How far could they have gone with these advanced designs of these airships? Would they even be considered airships at all? Perhaps that's the only way to refer to them as. Did they have some other means of propulsion and some other means of sustaining their altitude in the air? Was it always helium and hydrogen that were used, or were there other means that could have been used to keep these very impressive and colossal devices in the air? Or is this just simply the realm of science fiction, simply imagination that's gone too far? It is intriguing to think of the fact, though, that there were actual achievements of airships, and you can find no shortage of photos that show people walking into the actual hull of a rigid airship from one of the mooring towers. And so this does give us the impression that there were many capabilities that perhaps were simply not shared with us. Now, I'm not suggesting that there was some sort of intentional effort not to share the true capabilities of airships, but if we had nations that knew or had an idea that they were going to be involved in another worldwide or global conflict, as it were, soon, then perhaps they simply had a good reason to keep all of their classified documents secret. I mean, it makes total sense. You just buy your airship and you employ it and you refine it, such as this very impressive design that shows the use of airship in terms of even carrying aircraft. And there were even airships that were aircraft carriers that the United States attempted to use. And of course, both of them wrecked in bad weather or very questionable conditions. Consider what a civilization could do if it had airships that had no limits in terms of their range and their carrying capacity. What kind of materials could you transport where and when? Does this suddenly explain one of the means in which the previous civilization could have achieved its wondrous constructions of great buildings and structures across the land? Is it also another more elaborate form of infrastructure and transportation when you have advanced capacities on the ground taken in tandem with these incredible airships and what they could have achieved? This is probably the most alluring exploration when it comes to considering what the limits on this exploration were. And finally, what could we do if we had our own airship, if everybody had their own rigid version of the airship that they could explore anywhere in the land without a limit on range or capacity? Suddenly, it completely turns around everything from our understanding of the limits of technology. There's also the question that we have to ask is, why would the great nations of the land after World War II suddenly want to abandon the practicality of the rigid airship, the ability to continue to develop something that would defy the limitations of transportation at that time? Now, of course, we'll get the usual slew of explanations that It just simply wasn't in their best interest to do so, and that may be true. They simply opted to pursue the fixed-wing aircraft and the very large cargo aircraft capacities that we have. And yet you'll find no shortage of images. You'll find no shortage of ideas that go all the way back from the time of Jules Verne, which give us the idea that airships perhaps provided an entirely different form of existence, a more liberated form of the ability to travel, and not just to travel, but also to transport materials from one point to another. It doesn't matter what kind of terrain that you actually have, whether it's mountains or flatlands or even the coastal areas. You can transport anywhere at any point in time. And it may simply be speculation in terms of how far the capability of these airships actually evolved to. Yet, once again, there's no shortage that we have, much like with the buildings, that show that there are many different sketches, many different plans and ideas for how airships could have been used, such as this much larger airship that features an entire hospital on the top of it. You suddenly have the ability to have that truly mobile hospital, and you have all the capacity and capability that you need. Now, expand this to other ideas, other forms of civilization or a society that's no longer limited by time or space or range. Then you suddenly see the true potential of the rigid airship, the once more advanced design. But what are your thoughts? Was this a device from a previous civilization? Or is the mainstream account correct? Let me know in the comments. Thank you for joining me. Please like, comment, and subscribe.
Who is here to help the barbarian with the gauntlet of steel?
Who are you?
Never mind. The barbarian is to be killed at any moment. We must save him.
Unlock this door and leave that door.
Greetings, Prime Explorers, and thank you for joining me today. I wanted to assure you, or tell you, that I do actually have a shed somewhere where I'm building a secret airship, but that's not the situation, at least as of yet. However, I do actually have an airship project that's in the works right now, and what are the details behind this? Well, I thought I would share it with you. The first thing I wanted to share with you, though, concerned this particular website, www.airshipsonline.com, and I'll be sure to share that on the Prime Explorer link. I was going to put it in the video description, but then I realized that pretty much anybody can access the video description, whether they're a Prime member or not. So I just want to share this with you and allow you to look at this site, because there are sites and there are individuals out there that are trying to retain the knowledge of airships. However, how accurate are they? Because even on this site, and this is a pretty decent site, I have to say, they've got some great images on it, and they do have some technical data that may or may not be correct. Oh, here you go again, Aurelian, you're questioning everything. You're absolutely right, I question everything. And the reason that I do? Just look at this opening image here. Here on the left, we have the older airships, clearly from the early 1900s. we have a couple in some very modern-looking sheds, and then we have the modern airships on the right. And just looking at these three images, it tells me a lot of what I need to know about this. What do we have on the right? We have the modern blimp. Remember that a blimp is not a rigid airship. On the left, we do seem to have more of the rigid airship. So was there really a difference between the two? It appears that there is. In fact, all we seem to concern ourselves with in the modern times, or current technological era of the late 1900s and the early 2000s, are the blimps. That's what you see, anywhere and everywhere. You do not see the more developed rigid airship. And why is that? So what's Aurelian's airship project really about? Well, we look under airships here, and they've done a pretty good job of cataloging and documenting the historical British airships during the era of the airship. Quite intriguing for a variety of reasons, and these are where I obtained some of the images that I put into the exploration this last week on airships. This always fascinated me though, because when we look at the older models, they do seem to give us a greater sign of advancement than the more current models. And I'll just give you a couple examples. Now, they list all the British airships, and of course you might recall the 101, which is one that we looked at quite extensively and is one of the more well-known British airships. And yes, I tend to downplay my British connections for a variety of reasons, but I am well aware of what they originally alluded to, and the fact that, yes, there did seem to be quite the advanced research into rigid airships, namely culminating with the R101, and of course the unfortunate demise. And you look at this image right here, and it really gives you the impression of just how advanced and impressive this airship was for its time. And this was a genuine rigid airship, at least as we're led to believe. And there are several images, okay, that's not the best one, but there are several images where you can see it actually docked to the tower, and they even have technical specifications for the tower on this website. So it's one of the reasons why I find it rather impressive, such as the comparison here. You have the 101 compared size-wise to a 747. And of course the modern blimps, not really rigid airships. So very impressive overall. And I always appreciate images like this because it really feels as though that they are actually exploring a technology. It doesn't feel like this was a technology that everyone just developed at the same time and they embraced it. Now, I could be wrong about that, but to share my true feelings with Prime Explorers, the impression I get is that there were various forms of technology that were recovered or pressed back into service in the time frame that we may think of as the early 1900s. Of course, who knows if that was the actual time frame or not? Because as I've shared many times, that time frame from 1900s to 1940 or right up until the end of World War II has many questionable anomalies within it. And of course, we're still going to be exploring those. There'll be a Great Depression exploration coming out for everyone this week. But back on airships, you look at why there was this fascination with airships, and if they were obsolete, if, well, we're just going to develop planes in the interwar period between World War I and World War II, then why did the British and the United States focus on airship development? And of course, the 101 and its tragic, unfortunate ending, at least as we're told. And they even have this very well-developed diagram or PowerPoint slide of how the crash occurred. Isn't it intriguing how they document these crashes and these wrecks of these airships so spectacularly? In any event, going back to looking at the original airships though, what prompted this, according to the official history, was the incredible airships that the Germans had and used, or the Zeppelins, during World War I. And here you have some of these very impressive images. And you can see these are advanced, rigid airships. Now, is this because the Germans developed the technology, or did they simply happen to have access to remnants of the more advanced technology from the previous civilization? Well, as always, I leave that to you to decide, but my impression is the Germans seem to have access to a lot of the more advanced technology, for whatever reason. You can see that in the structures, you can see that in the equipment that they had. Now, is the breakdown of nations as realistic as we think it is? Do we really know what the actual political situation of the world wars really were? I don't think that we do. We're given a representation we're supposed to see, but I think there's a lot more that's going on behind the scenes. Because the other odd thing is at the end of the World War I, Germany had to surrender its military equipment to its former adversaries. Now, there is an account that the Germans sank their ships, the High Seas Fleet at the end of World War I, but they just willingly handed over these very impressive and advanced airships to their adversaries, the ones that had been used for terror strikes against the United Kingdom in World War I. And I always found that very intriguing that they would just hand these over and not scrap them much in the same way that they did their Navy. I mean, at that point, what were the Allies going to do? You didn't abide by the terms, you scrapped your military equipment. I mean, actually, the official history tells us that the Germans intentionally sinking the High Seas Fleet led to the Washington Naval Treaty. Now, granted, that's talking about naval ships, but why are airships any different? Because as we saw in the film, Things to Come, the specter of air power and all the terrors it would provide were one of the main considerations of going in the interwar period. And if you think about it, what could you really do with these rigid airships? And most importantly, look how advanced this appears. And there's always the question about what was really the intention behind these. If you concern yourself with ballistics and you focus on the shape of an airship, then you realize that maybe these airships actually had far more capabilities than we realize. I mean, they talk about their maximum speed being anything under 100 miles per hour. But what if there was an entirely different dynamic and dimension in the technology of these airships? And that was the real reason that these rigid airships actually had the most potential. And someone was seeking to unlock that potential. I mean, look at this. V-class Super Zeppelin, or Victor-class Super Zeppelin, however you want to say it. Very impressive. Look at that max height. 20,000 feet dynamic ceiling. Is that really the limitation? Max speed, 66 miles per hour. Is that really the limitation? I mean, we're to accept that these Zeppelins launched from Germany, flew over the English Channel, bombed the United Kingdom, and then returned to Germany, and did so without harassment. Now, they did say they shot a couple of them down, but what's the true story behind it? There's a lot of questionable things. Now, consider what we just looked at, and look at what modern British airships pass. And we'll, of course, just pull up the old Goodyear, because that's what we're all familiar with, and we see it's just a simple blimp. It's a simple balloon that's not rigid and just has a little gondola on the bottom of it. And this tends to be what passes for modern airships today. And they'll even scare people with these so-called airships that are really just blimps or balloons with gondolas on them. Watch the film Black Sunday from the 1970s, and they're still terrifying people with the specter of airships. So many different interesting considerations about how the previous technology compares with the modern technology. And of course, they'll tell you that the modern technology is a little bit better. Look, the maximum speed. Well, with winds in favor, it's only 55 miles per hour. Now you're probably asking, well, why are you making this big deal about these rigid airships? What's so special about them? Well, one of the reasons that the Graf Zeppelin impressed me, and why I think it is the most impressive design of all, is that it is documented that this airship managed to go anywhere. There are also many conflicting accounts concerning that round the world, across the land, around the globe, however you want to phrase it, but this airship could go anywhere. And there are other accounts that said that it went to all the lands in a much shorter time than 22 days. There's even some extreme accounts that say that it did it in 24 hours. Now, it could simply be someone's wild imagination. It could simply be a false report. It could be someone engaging in propaganda. But when you see the images of this airship everywhere, and there are images of the Graf Zeppelin everywhere, you have a different impression behind it. You also consider the fact that the shape of the Graf Zeppelin does have that dynamic ballistic shape. Now, why would it need that if it's just a floating airship that only goes 60 to 80 miles per hour? Imagine the ballistics if you actually had the capability to travel much faster. And we talk about how the altitude on these airships was likely not limited either. Then what kind of capacity and capability does that give you? We're just talking the ability to travel anywhere in the land in a very short amount of time. We know that even if the airships are limited in their velocity, they still have the capability to go anywhere. And we know that's not something that we're necessarily approved on. And so when you look at all this and you compare these modern airships, as they say, with the historical airships that are obsolete, I ask you to consider, what's truly the more advanced technology? What really had the greater capability? It's just like the buildings, only now we're seeing it with the airships. They have a really good map, though, on this site that talks about their main airship stations, and they even have some pretty good pictures of some of the original sheds. And I still think that the original sheds are very impressive infrastructure in and of themselves, the airship hangars. They're far larger than the hangars that we have for modern aircraft, and what kind of effort went into constructing them. They do have some images of construction of these, and I'll share this with you, as I said, in the Prime Explorer link, and you can look at your own leisure and let me know in the comments what you think about these airship stations. Apparently there was this very elaborate plan to establish an Imperial airship base and mast in what was the British Empire at that time, because remember, there was still the identity of the British Empire between World War I and World War II. Interestingly enough, though, they have the mast technical information here. Now, of course, some people will tell you that it took an entire crew of hundreds to actually moor this airship to the ground. Again, something else that I wonder if it's true, because there are conflicting accounts on that as well. But you can look at this at your own leisure, and you'll see that they do have some pretty interesting schematics or diagrams for these mooring towers. Although, again, I'm left with the question, was this actually an improvised design, or a design that came from someone's innovative mind? Or was this merely a recording on how to construct one of these towers? Reason being is that you can look at different towers and you'll actually see that some of them appear a lot more advanced than we might like to think. And going back to that one, I think I saw some of the more advanced towers down here, yes. So they do have some construction photos, and it does match some of the things that we've seen, but then you see other photos on the interior of the tower, and again, you're given the impression of much more advanced technology, something that seems to defy what we'd think of as the technological capabilities at the time. Now, I'm not saying that they couldn't have built this at that time, at least as we think of the 1920s, but could there be another explanation behind it? Are we actually looking at the remnant of more advanced technology that was renovated, refurbished, and pushed back into service? Again, we have to ask the question, what makes more sense? And the towers do interest me, because here at the bottom you can see the mast variations. And really interesting, though, with some of these masts is they have old world buildings at the bases on them. What was the requirement for that? It's just like thinking about the Eiffel Tower and Blackpool Tower. So again, all these interesting considerations and all these different variations of technology. And this one was in Canada, Montreal. And of course, they have a very impressive old world building at the base of the tower. Why? What's the need for that? We have to build this very impressive hard stand building so we don't have to have a crew of 400 to moor the airship to the ground because someone told us that? So those are all the things that I'll leave for you to take a look at. And you can certainly look at this original project that they had. Oh, here's the planned docking rafts. So yeah, airships everywhere. Airships and docking rafts. Airships that could land anywhere. Towers anywhere. Was the whole point of the towers to actually deconflict traffic above and beyond all else. And you can even look at this international plan that they had for some of these bases. And you can even look at Canada. So they talk about this Montreal mast that they had there. And they even give you an idea of what the concept of the plan was when you look in terms of where they were looking to establish these airship bases. So many different interesting things on this site. Oh, and then here they have the entire list of the bases and the mooring sites. And then the learning zone is also interesting. You can look up some of the historical documentation, although, again, I always wonder how much is questionable and what isn't. And then the other thing you can find when you search on this site is an actual history of airship accidents. And oddly enough, you'll find that there were probably about 4 or 5 that occurred before the Hindenburg and involved a greater loss of life than the Hindenburg, and yet that didn't stop airship development. Of course, we know the real reason. They didn't have a camera going at the other airships, and therefore it wasn't as dramatic. And yet, even though you can find just about any fixed-wing aircraft accident involves a much greater loss of life, and yet fixed-wing aircraft is the way to go. One of the other things you can find is you'll find there's a lot of documentation on some of these flight logs that you can pull up, and some of these are or appear to be original schematics and documents. But again, I'm questioning, are these actual innovative design plans, or are these merely recordings? Because when you look at it, you get the impression of both in some respects. So it's hard to say. Or was it that they located the technology and they simply augmented it in ways they could to get it operational again? It's really hard to say. There's a lot of conflicting accounts with it. So what is the final conclusion with Aurelian's airship project? I am actively determining and looking to ascertain if it is possible to construct an airship today and what it would take. And I'm not talking about the blimp, I'm talking about the rigid airship, the advanced airship. I'm also looking into what other possibilities there could be for propulsion and what concepts you really have for what are the limits of capabilities. Imagine if you have an airship that has no limits in terms of what altitude it could operate at, and then you have a velocity that's much greater, a velocity that matches, or dare I say, even exceeds that of modern passenger planes. If you go off of the rumors, and yes, I'll say it, I'll be honest about it, the rumors of the Graf Zeppelin, imagine if you had an airship that was even faster than what the Concorde was in the 1970s. Where could you go? What could you do?